everybody, it's Emily at ARG Schooling, and today I wanted to give a sort of July highlights wrap-up. So I read a lot in July. I read 17 books, and I don't think I have it in me to review all 17 of them. Some of them I read so far back now, it feels like I don't really remember enough to share. And I did a whole video for Summerween, so I don't really want to talk about those books again because I feel like I gave a pretty solid wrap up for that already. So we're going to start from the middle of the month basically and talk about some of my favorites that I read from that point on. So let's go ahead and start with Maeve Fly by C.J. Leede. I'd been wanting to read this for ages, so I was determined to make it happen in July, and I'm so glad that I did. This was super fun. I don't know that I would widely recommend this book because I feel like it's definitely not for everybody. If you cannot handle a lot of gore, some very disturbing things happening in the story. So if you can't handle that kind of stuff, this is not for you. But if you can, I think this is such a fun book. This follows our character Maeve Fly, who is working as basically a Disney princess. It's never specifically called Disney, but the way it's described, the way she talks about it, she's a Disney princess. She is portraying Elsa. And she loves her job. It is the best thing she has going on. She came out to LA. She lives with her grandmother, who was a movie star back in her day and sort of famous. And she adores her grandmother. And she has some very disturbing thoughts. And as the story progresses, you realize how unhinged she actually is. And she gets more and more unhinged as the story progresses. And you're in her head for all of it. And it is disturbing. It is gory. But it is also really compelling and fun. So I had a great time listening to this because I did the audiobook. And I thought the audio was pretty good. So I really enjoyed this. It was one of my favorites from the month. And then I followed that up with something completely different. And I read James by Percival Everett. I had been so excited to read this. I had been so looking forward to it. I was waiting for the longest time for the audio because I just really wanted to have the audio because I didn't know how dense this might be, being that it's based on a classic. Albeit a classic I've read at least a dozen times, because The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, I've always said, is one of my absolute favorite pieces of literature. Is it flawed? Yes. So I was very excited to see that James was coming out this year and that we were going to finally get a story from his perspective. And this was so good, but such a different vibe from the originals. I feel like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is a piece of satirical literature, but that it has a sense of almost whimsy, and it's kind of silly and it's poking fun, and it's very different from this. This feels a lot more somber, a lot more serious, because we're not following a little boy. We're following a grown man who has been enslaved his whole life, and he's escaped, and he doesn't know how he's going to survive this. And so it's a very different take on the story, but a very much needed one. And I loved getting his perspective, the way he talks about how the language they use has to be very specific when they're speaking to white people, but when they're on their own, they can speak in a more civilized way. And that kind of thing was just so interesting. And the fact that he I don't want to give anything away because this does take some different directions than the original. But I really liked seeing the story from his perspective. And I thought this was brilliant, very well done. Highly recommend if you've ever read Huck Finn and you're want something more from that, like this is definitely worth your time. I don't have a physical copy because I pre-ordered it. Like, I was reading, there's this comic series, and right now it's only available like in individual editions, and I was reading them on Hoopla, and I only read the first one, and it's called Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees, and that is by Patrick Horvath. And I heard about this through Sadie Hartman, and she was saying, she described it as like if Richard Scarry wrote horror, and it is exactly that. Like, it's very cutesy little animals, and one of them is a serial killer. And I read the first one, absolutely loved it. Went to look up and see if there was a bind-up, and there is, but it isn't out until September. But I immediately pre-ordered it because I want to read the whole thing in a physical copy. I feel like I will enjoy it more that way. And I also wanted to hand it to my daughter because she loves bears and animals and cutesy things, but she's also super morbid and dark and likes like horror. So I think this is like perfect for her. But it's like these cute cartoon animals, and they live in this little village, and one of them is a serial killer, and like he has really strict rules about like where he does his killing, but like one day somebody turns up dead in their town, and then an investigation starts, and he didn't do it, but he's worried that somehow is going to point to him. But like I cannot wait to get my hands on the bind up because it's good. I need to know where this goes. I read Forbidden City by Vanessa, who, this has been another one that was on my TBR for a while, and I'd been really wanting to read it. I'd had it in my TBR several times and just hadn't gotten to it yet. So, like, I made it happen in July, and I'm glad that I did. I even ended up, like, tabbing it. This was really interesting and sort of disturbing in a lot of aspects because we're following this character. This is set during the very beginning of the Cultural Revolution in China. So like 1965-ish, I think, is where it starts. And we're reading the story from the perspective of this girl who we know right away that she is now living in America. I think that the first little bit is like set in the 70s, and she's talking about her past. And then it goes back to when she was invited to join this troupe of girls, teenage girls, who basically follow the chairman around China, and like they're his entertainment. And she is so excited to be chosen for this. Like, the chairman is a god to her. Like, she's looked up to him her whole life, and that's pretty typical, I think, of people her age in China at that time. That, like, he's a legend, and so, like, the fact that she's going to get to be a part of his life, perhaps even interact with him, is just mind-blowing to her. And, like, she reads his book all the time, and, like, he's very revered. So she's chosen to join this troupe, and she ends up becoming very close to him, and so you're seeing her worldview shift as the story progresses, as she starts to understand like what's actually happening here and who is at fault for some of the things that are happening. And but it's also really disturbing because she's like 15, I think, at the start of this book, and she's in a relationship, a sexual relationship, which is very graphically explained throughout the story, with the chairman, who I think at this point in the story is like in his 60s or something. So like, it's uncomfortable to read at times, and the way it's written, it's meant to be uncomfortable. Like, you're supposed to feel that discomfort of like sitting with what's actually happening here. But it's very well done. The writing is beautiful. It is definitely a heavy book. Like, this was way more sad and distressing than I realized it was going to be going in. But I still really loved it and ended up giving it a 5-star rating because it was very good. It was just very unsettling to read, I think, is what I would describe it as. But again, kind of important read because like you don't often get to see this perspective of like that time period. So I thought it was really well done. I read Persepolis. This is the complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. I've had this on my shelves. I don't even know how long. A really long time. I read the first volume, because this is a bind-up of volumes 1 and 2. I read the first volume years and years and years ago and really liked it, which is why I purchased this. And I just never got around to finishing it. So I had to start over because I could not really remember enough about like what happens in the first book. So I read the whole thing, and this is really, really brilliant. And I don't really know how to talk about it because it's one of those things where like it was really good. It's a memoir. It's a story about her childhood and her like early adult years. Both like living in Iran and then moving away and living in, I think, Austria for a few years and then coming back home to Iran. And so like it starts with the revolution in 1979 and like how that affected her family. And then as things devolve, they send her away. Her parents are worried about her safety. There's been bombings, like their next door neighbors get bombed. So like they send her away. So she ends up spending her formative years in Europe and not feeling like she fits in there. And then comes back because she just misses her home, misses her family, and she comes back home and now she feels like she doesn't really belong here either. And it's a very interesting story because you're seeing like what it's like to live through a tumultuous event like that. But also like seeing somebody feeling so out of place everywhere they go. Like, where is home when your home is too dangerous to be there? And like, you have to figure out how to exist in a world that will always other you. And I think it's just a really beautifully done story. There's a lot of really dark humor in it, which I think is indicative of like a lot of cultures where there's a lot of turmoil. Like you end up having dark humor. And so there's a lot of that in here, but it's really well, like, I don't know how to talk about it. Like, it's really good. It's very good, and I definitely recommend it. The illustrations are all in black and white. They're kind of stark, which I think contrasts well with the story itself. But like, I don't know what more to say. Like, this was really good. I'm glad I finally finished it. Highly recommend. And then the last book I want to talk about is Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. I conquered my fear of reading this book because I read Parable of the Sower last year and loved it, even though it was very unsettling. And I went to go buy this. I was at the bookstore. I had it in my hand, and I looked at the back and was reading the synopsis on the back. And it literally had the phrase about it says, the fledgling group provides refuge for outcasts facing persecution after the election of an ultra-conservative president who vows to make America great again. I read that and immediately put it back on. I was like, I don't think I can handle that right now. So I didn't do it. And I was like, you know what? If I'm ever going to read it, if I'm ever going to tackle it, now is the time. So I borrowed it from the library. I've got the audiobook on Hoopla, and I did it. I conquered my fear. And I'm glad that I did, because while, yes, that was unsettling, this was so freaking good. Like, this duology might be my new favorite dystopian, apocalyptic story I've ever read. And, like, part of it is Earthseed itself is just such a brilliant, like, way to tell the story. Like, I think it's brilliant, and but the way that the story goes is, I think, way more hopeful than I expected it to be, being how dark the first book was, how upsetting. The fact that it starts in 2023, the fact that like does it start in 2024? And the fact that like this is only set in the 2030s. But what I really liked is that we're reading the story and we're being told the story through both her daughter's perspective and her perspective. And the daughter is reflecting on her mother's life and talking about like how she never really knew her, but like this is the information she's gathered about her. And so you're getting like her perspective of like who her mother was. And then you're reading Lauren's perspective as she's telling her story as it's happening. So yes, it is disturbing in that it feels a little too real, a little too similar to what we're heading into potentially. But it's done in a way that shows you that, yeah, things can get dark and things can get very bad, but you can still come out okay on the other side of that. Like you can still, there's a way through it, which I think is just a really important message to get out into the world anyway, because times will always be scary. Like there's always going to be something looming, and we just need to learn how to process that and how to get through to the other side. And so like I think this could be a really good book to read right now to help us get in the right mindset. I don't know what I'm saying anymore, but I really loved this, and like I think this might be my new favorite like apocalyptic dystopian duology. It's brilliant. I kind of want to reread again both back to back, like, and see, since it was like probably 6 months, 7 months, so, or somewhere around that between readings, but yeah. So those are some of the things I loved in the month of July. So let me know in the comments, what was your favorite book you read in July? I would love to hear about it. I think if I were pressed to choose, I'm going with Parable of the Talents, because like this was brilliant. Octavia E. Butler is a genius, a prophetess even. I don't know. She saw things coming, and like this was written in the 90s. Like she knew things, but this was brilliant. So I think that would be my favorite. Followed very closely by Mayfly and Fantastic Land. Those are like the three that I like were my standouts. So yeah, let me know down below what was your favorite thing you read in July, and we can chat about it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Happy reading. Bye.